Hello, everybody, and welcome back. In today's class, we're going to be talking about a very fun area of psychology known as social psychology. In fact, this is one that students love to tend to talk to their friends about and discuss some of the major themes and ideas that we cover in this particular section, and that's primarily because social psychology is a very, popular field nowadays, and lots of the research we find or discuss in this particular branch relates to lots of things that people are encountering on a daily basis. So the applications to these particular concepts, the ideas, are around us all of the time. And by understanding this field of social psychology, we can better make sense of ourselves and people around us in our social world. If we want to pinpoint exactly what social psychologists study, what we see in this particular branch is that social psychologists are interested in studying a number of different aspects. They're interested in looking at what happens inside your mind, your head, based on your interpretations and your sense of things, but also what happens outwardly, your expressions. So we look, just like behaviorists in social psychology, at human behavior. And when we look at these two factors, we assume and we study a number of different things that can affect them. And one of the big things we look at is just the social world. So different social factors or environmental factors that can impact or change a human's thoughts and behavior. But we also, in the field of social psychology, spend a lot of time studying groups, looking at how groups can affect an individual or how an individual can affect groups. What's also interesting to a lot of social psychologists is you can even see that groups, just being groups, can change the dynamics of that group and the way people interact with each other. And since we don't have time to cover all the different social psychology areas that are out there, and there's no real one person that shaped this field, instead of doing what we've done in past classes, what we're going to do today and in the second part of class is discuss the general idea of what social psychologists study. So we'll look at two of the major areas or two of the major topics that have gained a lot of interest over the years and talk about some of the more groundbreaking research that's been done in those particular areas. In the first part of today's class, what I'd like to do is talk about an area called social perception. To introduce you to this, what I thought we'd do is a little activity. This activity requires you to think back at least a couple years, probably in the first one, maybe just a few minutes in the second one. What I want you to do in the first activity is think back to your best friend, maybe in high school or your current best friend, if you've got a really good one now that you can think of. What I want you to do is think back to when you first met. When you first met, I'd like you to remember, when was it that you decided that you actually liked this person? Was it right away, or did it take a while for you to warm up to this individual? And when you're asked to describe this person to another individual now, I'd also like you to think of how you would actually describe them, articulate who they actually are. As you're thinking about this, let's move on to the second activity, where instead of thinking of somebody you really liked, think of somebody that just recently did something that annoyed you, that got you very upset. I want you to not only think about which person that was, but why was it that they irritated you? What was it that set you off? And the last question I want you to ask yourself is, if you've seen them since that point, is there still that residual effect? Are you still angry with them, or do you still have that kind of bias towards their behavior? Both of these questions, about you judging your friends, you judging others, you making sense of the actions of others and your friends, you determining what somebody's like, is all a part of this field called social perception. Social perception looks at how we judge others and how we make sense of our environment. When we look at the field of social perception, what we see is that there's a number of questions that people in this branch of social psychology ask. A number of people studying social perception ask a very prominent question, and that's, when do we start to form these perceptions? When we think of our best friend, we might ask, did you discover that you like this person right off the bat and quickly become best friends? Or was it a slow, gradual process that required many months and years before you had any inkling that you liked them? Another question we might ask is, when we're talking about forming perceptions, does it work the same for groups as it does for individuals? If you meet somebody from, say, a neighboring school, do you form a perception of that person in a different way because you know they're from that school? Or do you form a perception of them the exact same way you would form a perception of an individual? And once these perceptions are formed, another question we can ask is, can we change them? If I don't like my neighbor, can I make myself like this particular individual? And if so, how can I actually do it? And then when we look at this last question of perception, can I change my perceptions? We might also want to look at how we actually make impressions of ourselves. Right? If we're doing something for ourselves to justify who we are, to make sense of what we're like, we do this for somebody else, or do we do different things and operate on completely different mechanisms? These are some of the questions that we're going to be addressing in this class. They're some of the major questions that social perceptual psychologists have grappled with over the last couple decades. We won't be able to answer every subtle nuance to probably every question that you might have, but we can at least get a semi-coherent story about all of these questions in today's class. When we talk about perceptions, as I said earlier, one of the first questions we ask is, when are our perceptions of others formed? Most people have a tendency to think that they're very thoughtful when it comes to trying to discover whether or not they like something, whether they prefer one individual over another, or whether they have a positive or negative perception of others, or whether or not they assume specific characteristics about certain people. As social psychologists, even though we do recognize that people do have a tendency to be thoughtful at times when trying to make sense of their environment, more often than not, we have a tendency to be fairly what we call automatic. And instead of thinking about people in great extent when we first meet them, most research shows that we judge people fairly quickly. Once we make that judgment tends to linger. In fact, it lingers so much we have a name for this particular effect. We call it the primacy effect. So if I meet you and I decide that you are indicative of an athlete, or you're somebody that's maybe very smart, then the odds are fairly good that I'm going to continue that perception of who you are, regardless of what you do in the future. And that continued perception has a strong impact on kind of all of the interactions that I might have with you. What it also tends to do, and it's just very interesting for social psychologists, is it changes the dynamic of our relationship. So if I come into a room, meet you for the first time, you tell a joke, and I say, oh, this person's very funny. I really think this person's interesting. Not only is that going to shape the way I perceive you, my memory of what you're like, but it might actually change your behavior when you're around me. So I'm going to think you're funny, and therefore I'm going to encourage you to tell more jokes, to do different things. In the long run, when we're interacting with each other, theoretically, you might be funny more often than you are around other people. This is something that was actually proven in a really ingenious study that I believe is discussed in the book. In this study, what researchers did was they paired up heterosexual males and females in an experiment, and they said that they were going to have a phone conversation with each other. So they would bring the males into a separate room, the females into a separate room, never having met. The females would sit down and be told that somebody was going to call them and they were going to have a conversation for a few minutes. The conversation didn't have to be about anything, but they just wanted to hear the flow of communication for this study. The males were then brought into a separate room, told that they were going to have a conversation, just like the females were. But a little bit of extra information was given to the males. In this study, males were given a picture of a girl that supposedly was going to be the one that they were going to talk to. Half the males were given a picture of an attractive girl. The other half of the males were given a picture of a less than attractive girl. After that, they were then told to not worry about the picture since they were never going to meet this woman, but encouraged to have the conversation nonetheless. If any of you have been around a heterosexual males in their college years, you probably know and would expect that the males changed their behavior due to the attractiveness of the girls. They were more flirtatious, more kind, more, I guess, patient with the girls in the conversation when the girl was attractive or paired with an attractive photo. And they were much less kind, much more hostile, much more terse, or I guess responded in very short responses with the girl that was paired with an unattractive picture. And remember, these girls were not the ones that were actually in the picture. They just happened to be paired with either an attractive or an unattractive picture. If that's all we saw with this particular effect, it wouldn't be that interesting. But what researchers also did is, outside of listening to the males on the phone, they also had people listening to the female side of the conversation. And what they would do is block the male's voice and listen to what the females were saying. And what they found was really interesting. When they gave the female side of the conversation to individuals and asked them to rate how attractive they thought these females were, a very pronounced effect occurred. The females that were paired with the attractive face were rated as much more attractive than the females that were paired with the unattractive face. What this says is, just by expecting you to be something, behave something, or behave in some way, or have some quality, I can theoretically, for a short period of time, change your behavior to get you to kind of align with that particular characteristic. It shows us how powerful these self-fulfilling prophecies can be. Which is why maybe some of you, when we were growing up, had parents that were very, very forceful in making sure that in the first day of school you were very well behaved, well dressed, very nice, because the idea was that once an impression of you is made, it could really carry over. And this is something that we've actually proven in another study on something called the Pygmalion effect. And to see the effects of the Pygmalion effect, I want you to go to the link that you see there, which will bring you to the Discovering Psychology series. Click on the Constructing Social Reality video and go to 11 minutes and 50 seconds. And there you'll watch about 5 minutes of video talking about the Pygmalion effect and how these self-fulfilling prophecies can be very powerful in things that we don't usually attribute to social psychology. After you're done, please come back and we'll move on to the next slide. Now, one of the questions you might be asking if you've seen that video is, well, if this is something we can apply to the individual, what happens when we start talking about groups? Well, a number of social psychologists have spent their lives looking at group interpretations and how we make sense of them. And when we talk about this particular idea, there's some terms we have to introduce that most people think they understand, but as social psychologists we have slightly different interpretations of what they mean. These particular terms are stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Stereotypes are things that we usually discuss or use in our normal terminology in order to try to describe how somebody perceives another individual. More often than not, though, if you're not in a social psychology class, you have an impression that stereotypes are always a bad thing. In social psychology, we just define stereotypes as generalized beliefs about a group. And those generalized beliefs can, in social psychology, be both negative and positive. So if I think that all 7 feet tall people are athletic, it's not necessarily a bad thing. If I think, of course, all people of a specific race are slow or are kind of lazy, then that particular perception definitely is indeed negative. The big thing in social psychology is both of these are considered stereotypes. Another thing we see in social psychology is that stereotypes theoretically can be beneficial. Another thing that rubs people wrong when they're not taking a social psychology class. If I see somebody dressed in a blue jumpsuit with their name on their shoulder and wearing a hat, carrying a mop, I might assume this person's probably a janitor. So if I have something that doesn't work, I might ask this person for help. Well, that particular action is based on a stereotype. It's assuming that people that wear those particular clothes are indeed janitors or people that are capable of fixing things. My asking them for help from that particular issue is again an example of me stereotyping, assuming that they're capable of fixing those things. Fortunately for me, more often than not, if people are wearing those outfits and are carrying something like a mop, then I'm probably going to be right. We see this all the time in social psychology. Even though there's oftentimes when people don't represent the groups that they seem to be paired with, they're different from the general groups that are there. If we can create accurate stereotypes, accurate assumptions about people within a group, we can theoretically interact with people much more effectively. The problems with stereotypes arise when those perceptions become negative, importantly, unfairly negative. When we're doing that, we're creating something called a prejudice, an unfavorable attitude towards a group of people, primarily because of some stereotype that we have about them. When we look at prejudices for a long period of time, researchers assumed that prejudices were based on just some simple things: age, race, gender, religious affiliation, and that these things were really, really important, so that's why prejudices arose. Subsequent research, though, has shown that we seem to be able to form prejudices on just about anything. And once they're formed, we can act in a way that really highlights those prejudices and causes us to treat a person unfairly, primarily just because they're a part of their group. We call this discrimination. What I'd like you to do now is, again, go to that Discovering Psychology series, go back to that Constructing Social Reality video, and this time go to 5 minutes and 32 seconds in the video. And you will see a video that discusses a groundbreaking experiment done actually by an elementary school teacher. And what you'll find from that video is that when we talk about prejudice and discrimination, we seem to be able to form prejudice and discrimination about any random thing, in this particular case, eye color. And this really highlights the need to lessen our assumptions that prejudice and discrimination can be based on fact or something there. Because what we can see in this video is that people have the adaptability to form prejudices and discrimination at random, and that it's nothing special that we have with religion or gender or anything else that we discussed that causes us to have these negative attitudes towards individuals. After you're done with that video, please move on to the next slide. Now, when we're looking at these negative attitudes that people form about individuals, what oftentimes researchers argue is that these have to come from somewhere. And more often than not, most social psychologists argue is that we form these attitudes because of behaviors that we see other individuals committing. If I see you as an athlete and I see you, say, skipping lots of class, doing certain things that most students don't do, I might say, oh, this person's lazy, and all athletes must be lazy. Or I could just say you in particular are lazy. When I'm doing that, I'm basing my assumptions of who you are on your behaviors. This idea of making sense of behaviors is, again, something social psychologists have been interested in for many years. When we're talking about making sense of somebody, explaining why they're doing the things they're doing, we get into a new area of social psychology called attributions. Attributions, theoretically, is a process that we use to determine what somebody's like, to base their behavior on the situation or their personality. When I make attributions, I can do it in two ways. If I see you commit a behavior, I can assume that that particular behavior is a part of you or just a product of the situation. If I assume it's a part of you, I'm making something called an internal attribution. So in the picture you see to your right with Roy, if I'm aliens and I'm walking off of my spaceship coming down to Earth, and the first second I introduce myself to somebody in this particular world, and he then goes ahead and squeezes my head and starts shaking violently, I'm probably going to make an internal attribution. Assume you're doing this because of something about you. If, however, I make the assumption that your behavior is based on the situation, the social context, then I'm making an external attribution. So for us, when we look at Roy, we might say a hand's being extended to him. When that happens, you're supposed to shake it. It's nothing to do with Roy that he's shaking the head. It's just a social norm. This idea of determining if somebody's behavior is internally or externally based is what we theoretically can use to determine what somebody's like, whether or not we like or dislike them, and what individuals within a group might have associated with them. But how we make those internal and external attributions is a very interesting story. For a long period of time, social psychologists grappled with the question of what led us to make an internal or an external attribution about somebody. And after a number of theories were proposed, one prominent idea started popping up, called the covariation model. And in the covariation model, what researchers proposed is that we could make a very accurate assumption about whether or not somebody's behavior was internally or externally motivated by asking 3 questions. Question 1 was about something called consensus. We would see somebody acting some way and ask, does everyone respond the same way in this situation? So, if I'm those aliens walking off the ship, Roy comes and squeezes my head, I might ask, does everybody squeeze my head? So I might go to other individuals, go to other worlds. If every single person squeezes my head the first second I come off the plane, then I might start to assume that this is entirely an externally motivated behavior. Or I should make what's again called an external attribution about this particular behavior. If, however, not everybody's doing this is only kind of a one-time thing with this one individual, then I have to move on to the next question before I determine if I need to make an internal attribution. The next question I ask is about distinctiveness. Namely, I ask, does this person often respond the same way in other situations? So after Roy squeezes my head, I might follow him around, watch him interacting with other individuals. And if lo and behold I find that Roy is squeezing everybody's head, I'll probably say, this seems to be an internally motivated behavior. I'd be making an internal attribution for his behavior. If, however, though, he just seems to be squeezing my head, then I probably would have to move on to the last question before determining if it's an internal or an external attribution I need to make for his behavior. This question is about what's called consistency. And when I ask, does this response occur every single time I encounter Roy? So after the first time I see him, does he shake my head again? The third time I see him, does he shake my head again? Over and over and over again. If it does keep happening every single time, then I assume that there's either something between us, or it's something that's partially because of him that's causing him to do this over and over again. If it just happened this one time, only time ever it happened, then what I theoretically should be doing is making, again, an external attribution to his behavior. Assume that some random event caused him to do this. Maybe he had a spasm in his hand, maybe he didn't know what was appropriate, so he just acted in some weird way. This idea of the covariation model was very attractive because theoretically it allowed us to answer questions in very scientific ways when we watch the behaviors of others. Let's give this a shot. So, if you were, say, sitting in your local school, maybe you were a kindergarten teacher, and you saw a young boy named Bob punch Susie in lunch, and you want to make an attribution about Bob's behavior. You want to say, is this an internally motivated behavior or an externally motivated behavior? You'd ask 3 questions. What I'd like you to do on your own is try to remember what those 3 questions are and figure out what the answers to each of those questions actually meant. Review that, and when you're done, move on to the next slide. Now, this covariation model was really attractive. Social psychologists were really enamored with it, and they started applying it to a number of situations. But after we'd used it for a while, we stumbled across something that kind of caused a bit of a hiccup in this particular theory. And that was the fact that even though we can be very scientific about judging others, we seem to be really bad at it. In fact, what numerous researchers have shown over the years, at least in Western cultures, we don't calculate anything at all. Instead, what we have a tendency to do is automatically make one particular attribution when we're judging others. This particular attribution we make always is an internal one. In fact, this particular effect is so unbelievably strong that we give it a very special name. We call it the fundamental attribution error, because it's so ingrained within most people that we don't even consider the possibility of making the alternate choice. In essence, what the fundamental attribution error says is when I'm judging your behaviors, I'm going to always assume that your behavior is indicative of you. And this particular effect was shown in a very ingenious experiment that showed how unbelievably powerful this fundamental attribution error was. In this study, students in the United States sat in a classroom and were instructed by the teacher to have to write pro or anti-Castro essays. Usually the class was split in half, and the instructor told in front of all of the other students, a group of the students, that they had to write a pro-Castro essay. Fidel Castro being a very controversial figure in Cuba around 40 years ago. The other half of the participants were told in front of other students, that they had to write an essay that was strongly opposed to the actions of Fidel Castro. Remember, all students watched their classmates get these instructions. All students themselves were forced to write these essays. And after they wrote the essays, the students would turn them in, and the instructor or the experimenter returned the essays back to the students, giving random students random essays from their classmates. Then the students were asked to rate how much these people in writing these essays actually liked or disliked Fidel Castro. Now, since they were encouraged to read through what was written and get a true sense of the person's feelings. And what they found was really interesting. Almost everybody who wrote a pro-Castro essay was believed to actually like Fidel Castro. And almost everybody who wrote an anti-Fidel Castro essay was believed to not like Fidel Castro. This seems ironic considering they all saw every other one of their classmates get forced into writing these essays. But this is how strong the fundamental attribution error is. Even if I know that your behavior is entirely externally motivated, I'm inclined to make an internal attribution. This effect had been replicated time and time again for a number of decades, and then something interesting happened. Namely, we started going to other cultures and studying this particular idea. What we found was very, very surprising. Kai-Ping Pong, a researcher actually at UC Berkeley, the area that I'm at, found that this fundamental attribution error is anything but fundamental when we look at different groups. What I'd like you to do to get a sense of his research and what he found is go to that Discovering Psychology series again and go to video 26, Cultural Psychology, and open up the video to minute and 48 in so you can watch the research of Pong and also some of the major conclusions that he had there. Afterward, as usual, progress on to the next slide. Now, one thing that we've also found when we talk about judging others is the fact that when we judge ourselves, a lot of the rules that we discussed are actually off the table. In fact, when we judge ourselves, we almost do the opposite of the fundamental attribution error. This is because of something we call the actor-observer effect. Namely, when I'm trying to determine why I'm doing something, I have a penchant to talk about external factors, or I need to describe external attributions to most of my behaviors. An example of this would be if I'm late for school. If I'm late for school, it's because something caused me to be distracted. Somebody or something in the environment prevented me from making it on time. If my friend's late for school, though, it's because my friend's tardy. If somebody I don't know is doing something, then I know it's because, well, there may be a lazy person or a bad individual. What the actor-observer effect argues is that the more distant we get from ourselves, the more likely we are to make internal attributions of the behaviors of others. And this was something that was proven in a study that involved 3 characters, 2 of which the participants had introduced themselves. In the study, what students were asked to do was write down their own name, the name of a very close family member, and then they also had to identify that they knew a very popular figure in the United States around 30, 40 years ago named Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite was big because he was kind of the primary newscaster for almost every American news channel out there. And Walter Cronkite, though very popular, was not very well known. We didn't have lots of scandalous information about his life, what he did. In fact, most people, even though they saw him every night, didn't know if he was married or single or whether or not he had a family at all. This was perfect for the researchers in this study, because what they would do is get the person, again, write their name, write their family member's name, and they used Walter Cronkite as the third person. And then they would present students with facts. So they'd say, you were caught speeding on the road, or your family member was caught cheating on a test, or Walter Cronkite slept in and missed work. And what they then asked people to do was explain why these behaviors were occurring. And what they found related very strongly to this actor-observer effect. And when people were justifying their own behaviors, describing why they did the things they did, almost everything was an externally motivated factor. Every single time they did it, they made external attributions. When they talked about family members, half the time they were making external attributions. The other half of the time they were making internal attributions. But with Walter Cronkite, every single time they would commit the fundamental attribution error, or make internal attributions for Walter Cronkite's behavior. However, when we look at this actor-observer effect, there is one catch. And that's the fact that when people are judging themselves, they have a tendency to actually reverse this effect when positive behaviors are displayed by themselves. So if I fail a class, it's because it was a stupid class, or the instructor was really mean, or essentially there was no way for me to do well because of all of these constraints that were going on. But if I do well in a class, it's not because the instructor was nice or things just kind of came together. It's because I'm very intelligent, or I'm very smart, or I'm a very good student. Essentially, we can make internal attributions when good things happen, but stay with the external attributions when bad things happen. We call this the self-serving bias, or it's also sometimes called self-serving attributions. Now, what's really interesting, though, when we talk about this actor-observer effect and self-serving bias, again, when we compare it to other cultures, is the fact that it seems to be, just like the fundamental attribution error, reversed when we go to East Asian cultures. So, even though in the United States the actor-observer effect is still very profound, self-serving attributions are even becoming more profound, in East Asian cultures, we tend to make very, very internal motivations or internal attributions to our own behaviors, and very strong external attributions to the behaviors of distant others. But when we do badly in East Asian cultures, then that bad performance is internally motivated. But if we do well, that particular behavior is usually attributed to some external factor. something that allowed us to do well that has nothing to do with who we are. We believe that this is part of a cultural thing based on of encouraging admittance of wrong and of encouraging and of acceptance of shame and trying to always better ourselves. But we don't know what the long-lasting effects of both groups are with this particular effect. Regardless of what the effects are, the fact that it exists is really intriguing to social psychologists because it shows us that part of our social behavior is possibly part of what we learn to do, or at least motivated by what we learn to do as we're growing up. This marks the end of the first part of this section of social psychology. As you recall, we talked a lot about this idea of social perception. We talked about some of the major questions that social perceptual psychologists ask. In the next part of class, we're going to discuss another major area of research in social psychology called obedience, or I guess conformity and obedience. If you haven't done the readings for that section yet, please do that. And we'll be moving on in the next half, kind of prep for the exam and give you the last bit of information that's coming up.